And let me welcome you formally. My name is Stephen Fetter, and I manage the United Learning Program for the General Counsel Office. And it is a delight and a pleasure to be with you. Um, Hang on, let me just copy the note I put to Linda because she's still having trouble. So just a couple of things about Zoom so that we can get those out of the way before things begin. First of all, if you haven't found it already, I'd encourage you to open the chat. You can move your mouse over top of our pictures and the Zoom icons will come up at the bottom of your screen. Click the one that says chat and it'll open a box down the side of your screen, or maybe it'll be attached to your window, maybe it won't, depends on how you used it last time. You type down at the bottom where it says type message here, and as long as the bubble just above that says everyone, then we can all see it. If it has a particular name, then it'll be a private message only to that particular person. We're going to use the chat tonight primarily as your way to talk to us. So there are 39 on the line right now. We've got about 53 registered. So that means that we really don't have the time to be able to open the mics and just have a free-for-all of questions and answers. So my role in this process tonight really is to collect the questions and curate them and mush them together so that if we get 5 people asking approximately the same thing, I'll just offer that to Catherine or to John. And so I'm going to be mostly behind the scenes. In fact, I'm going to show the PowerPoint through my camera screen so that you won't see me most of the time. But I'll be watching the questions, and when we come to a Q&A point, I'll step in and kind of moderate that way. Please use the chat for as many questions as you like. This is more fun and more interesting and goes in the directions you really find most helpful if you use the chat that way. Anything else you need to know about Zoom, put a message into the chat and I'll try to follow up with that. I should say sometimes the chat runs very fast and there is no obligation on you to read it. The only person who has to read it is me. Anybody else is welcome to, and but it's my job to keep on top of it. And the reason that I'm doing it is so that Catherine and John can talk and they don't have to. So don't feel pressured by it, but use it as a tool so that you can talk to them, you can pose your questions, and I will pull that together at the Q&A points. How can I have my picture showing in the gallery? Right now, probably there's a bunch of thumbnails right across the top of your screen. And on my screen, after about 6 of those thumbnails, there's a little blue arrow and you can click through and see some of the other thumbnails. So if that's what you're asking, Rosemary, you can do that. If you're wondering how to have a thumbnail of yourself when your camera is off, you set up that in your personal profile on your desktop. If you're using an iPad, and some of you probably are, the controls are a little different, but they really all do the same thing. Touch the screen and then look for the icons that seem to make sense and follow them through. If you find that the sound is choppy and breaking up and it would be better to listen on phone, the easiest way to do that is to move your mouse over the screen and go down to the bottom left where you'll see the microphone icon. Beside it, there's a little up arrow, and that'll give you a whole bunch of audio options, including the option to switch to telephone audio. You can click that button, you get a pop-up box. One of the options on the pop-up box says call me, which is the most convenient. You just push in your phone number and Zoom will phone you. You've got a call on your phone and they will connect you, and then your picture is connected to your phone, and it's easier for us all. So that's what I recommend, and I can put those instructions again in the chat if we need to. So John and Catherine wrote this book 5 years ago. And growing out of this book called Preaching the Big Questions, they got invited to do workshops and come and be theme speakers at conferences and sort of help the church think about taking the dusty doctrines that we all learned in theology school and then left on the shelf and putting them into a way of helping us reflect on current issues and real life. And people have been so excited by what they do that we just keep calling them back to do it more. I called on Catherine to do some stuff last spring in the pandemic, and we had a series last fall where they picked up 3 doctrines. This time they're not talking about doctrine so much as issues, but as we kind of noodled together what would be fun to do for a sequel to last year's program, we realized that just with the timing, somebody's adding their face into Dolores's camera. I love it.
My son is helping me.
Perfect. Everybody needs a son. Sorry, I got thrown off there completely. So no, we thought just because we're meeting at this time of year, last week was All Saints Day and next week is Remembrance Day and Christmas is right around the corner. We thought, what is going to be top of mind for those of us who are on the preaching treadmill week by week by week? And we thought Remembrance Day, saints, angels. What does the church say? And we're certainly not the only generation that has ever struggled with this or been looking for deep and helpful ways to do that. So I pitched it to them. We kind of noodled this out together and decided that would be a fun thing to do. And then somebody online said, "You got the order wrong. You started talking about saints, but All Saints Day is past, and I'm still working on my Remembrance Day sermon. And couldn't you switch them?" So, okay. So that's what we're doing, and we're doing the soldiers first instead of the saints. And if you signed up early, you probably are surprised, but that's okay. Alan, we talked about starting it a week earlier, and you know what? When we planned this out, John was supposed to be traveling. He has this day job, you see, that gets in the way of the important things. But he was supposed to be in Vancouver or something like that, and so we set the dates for this. And then last Wednesday night, I was on the line with church treasurers, and we had 500 church treasurers trying to figure out government subsidies, so I wasn't available. So
actually, I was supposed to be in Asia.
Asia. Well, that would be much more fun than Vancouver.
Actually, probably,
anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, just getting back around the end of the month, so of October.
Sure. Christine is asking about the book. There are paper copies of the book at the UCRD bookstore. Last I heard, there were some issues with the UCRD bookstore website. It was selling stuff for free. So they took it down until that could be fixed, because we can't afford to do that. But you can phone them and give them the discount code that was in the confirmation of registration email, and they will give you 20% off the book. So by all means, give them a call and order the book if you'd like it. And don't worry if the website is still down. It may be back up again. I haven't heard, but last week it was giving away stuff for free, and we were going to go bankrupt. So, and there it is. Catherine's got a copy. Good show. So we won't really spend a lot of time flogging the book tonight, but I thought you should at least know about that. I'm going to get out of the way, and I can't remember. I think it's John opening, but I can't remember for sure. So, John, over to you.
I have a prayer, Steve, before we...
go ahead. Then by all means, pray us in.
Yeah, so I invite you to where you are, draw a breath, acknowledge that we're not alone in this land, and we strive for relationship with those who have been on the land before us and those who are our neighbors and friends, and for those who will follow us. And we pray. Holy One, follow, you say, and we do. Love your neighbor, you say, and we do. Care for the widow and the orphan, you say, and we do. Do justice, love kindness, walk humbly with me, you say, and we do. We have these values in common, and yet we are divided. One house against another, one nation against another. Politics, military, our very souls. As we are deeply divided, bring us your blessing. Show us the wisdom of those who have gone before, and bring us the creativity, imagination, and integrity of our own minds and souls, together in this time and beyond, to heal divisions and to make sense of the themes of our time. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. And again, to reiterate something that Stephen has already said, it's very good to be with you tonight. And again, as we all get used to this particular platform, that I can speak to you from my home and know that folks are scattered all across this land. And in fact, in the case of Neil, well beyond it in Austria. So Stephen, I'm also going to ask if you can move the slides. That would be helpful, the PowerPoint. And as Stephen said, what we've done in the past have usually been to look at doctrines, and this is in fact more of a theme. And I've just on the slide put up three things. The first is a title of a piece that Martin Luther wrote in 1527, wrestling with the question of, wrestling with this matter in response to a question from a follower of his about who was, we would now say an officer, about whether it was okay for him to be a soldier and whether in fact by being a soldier was he putting his soul in mortal danger. And I'll talk about Luther's thoughts about this later. And I'm aware in coming to this topic of an ambivalence in Christian history about whether a Christian should be a soldier. This is not a new question. It's one that's been around since the early days, relatively early days of the church. And it surfaces from time to time in Christian history. And also in coming at the topic, aware that Remembrance Day is a week from today, and knowing from my own days in congregational ministry that on the Sunday before November 11th, many of us in the places we serve will in that service in some way reflect on that reality, whether it is a short ritual, whether it's in the sermon, whether it's the entire service. So those are really themes to which or matters to which I'll come in the course of what I want to say tonight. So again, Stephen, if you can advance the slides for me. In the early church, so I'm talking here the generations immediately after Jesus' death and resurrection, early Christians did not engage or serve in either government or the military. There was no Christian position or thinking about what being a soldier would mean or participating in war during that earliest period. We know from the scriptural witness, though, that, for example, soldiers, these would have been Roman soldiers, came to John the Baptist and asked, what is it that we should do? And John tells them that they should not extort money from folks by threat or accuse people falsely, and that they should be content with their wages. But this is, of course, before Jesus' ministry is established, and also certainly before Jesus' death and resurrection. So there isn't a Christian position early on, and there are a couple of good reasons for that. For Christians in those first couple of generations after Jesus' death, they lived believing that the end of the world would come within their lifetimes, and certainly before the end of the first century of the Common Era. So if you think that the world is coming to an end, you're going to be about spreading your message and endeavoring to be in right relationship with God. And so there was not that kind of involvement. And the Roman army was initially, Roman authorities were initially really pretty much ignoring of Christians, but there was the kind of engagement starts after the first century. What we know is that as you start to move through the late second century and into the third, I say in the slide here, probably, in fact, it's certain that there begin to be some soldiers in the Roman army who are Christian. And as time passes for them, for some of them at least, there comes to be again a bit of a crisis of conscience about whether what they do is in alignment with the teachings of Jesus. As you get toward the last part of the third century and the early fourth, there are increasing numbers of folks in the Roman armies who are Christian. And it simply reflects the spread of Christianity in the Roman Empire, especially during the 3rd century, and more especially during the last half of it. And what attracts soldiers to Christianity is what attracted other people to Christianity. The kind of witness that early Christians made, their willingness to care for others, their willingness to stand strong in the face of persecution and to be martyred. Tertullian's line that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church is in fact exceedingly true. By the turn of the early 4th century, the Roman Empire is continuing to struggle with threats from without, and in its own leadership is divided. And in the eastern part of that empire, what we now think of as Turkey and that general region, a Roman, not the emperor for that section, but his sub-lieutenant, is so concerned about the number of Christians in the army and whether in fact they can be counted on to fight in time of war, that he initiates a persecution of them, forcing them to choose between staying in the army and living or being killed. And that persecution spreads to other parts of the empire, primarily though in the eastern part, not so much in the western part, sort of basically Rome and what's now Western Europe. And so we know that, again, this is simply the result of the spread of Christianity, but there develops a major battle for control amongst several folks who all want to be emperor. And Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. And the person who emerges victorious from that, out of the sort of 4 claimants, is the person we know as Emperor Constantine. I've put this symbol up. It's a symbol called Chi-Rho from the Greek letters, which the first of which, what looks to us like an X in that, which is the Greek letter, we would translate it in English as CH, and then Rho, R, and you have, of course, the first several letters of Christos, the Greek term for Messiah or the Christ. This becomes an early Christian symbol, and the reason I put it here is on the eve of a battle, the Battle of Milvian Bridge against one of his rivals, Constantine, who is not a Christian at this point in time, has a dream, and in his dream, a figure appears to him telling him that he should have his soldiers put this emblem on their helmets before they go into battle. And so he does that. And he wins the Battle of Milvian Bridge in most unlikely circumstances. He attributes his victory to the intervention of the Christian God, whose symbol he has had his soldiers put on their helmets. Military folks would argue that he wins because, in fact, Maxentius, his opponent, does the very unwise thing of being secure behind the walls of Rome, entering out and engaging in combat with Constantine in an open field and being defeated. But for Constantine, this is important. He becomes the emperor, and as he does, and Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. Actually, just before we leave that one, I should note, this is a kind of tangential comment. In the 1970s, for some reason, and I have no idea why, I saw this symbol frequently on wedding invitations. And occasionally as a symbol people would put on cakes when they were getting married. Not sure why. I mean, other than, well, I know what it represents, and something very different for us now from what it represented for Constantine, but that's just a little tangential comment I make because I'm sort of moving on. So Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. Constantine, feeling in this case, or thinking he has been to some degree favored by this god, makes Christianity initially a legal religion in the Roman Empire. So this is the first time that Christianity has been legal. It's been, depending on where you were, either persecuted or generally overlooked. And then at a later point in his reign, he makes it the only legal religion of the Roman Empire. And so with Constantine consolidating his power as emperor, there is no longer a perceived conflict, as I say here, between being a soldier and being a Christian. And in fact, Christians are now motivated to become soldiers in order that they can help to defend the empire against those outside it, known as the barbarians, who are continuing to threaten it and will do so. As we move again beyond Constantine, he becomes emperor, and we're talking here the early part of the 4th century. As you move through the 4th century, you have some key Christian figures who've had military careers before they become key Christian leaders. Probably the two of the famous ones, Saint Martin of Tours, but also Ambrose of Milan. He becomes the Archbishop of Milan, a key early Christian figure. And it's Ambrose who first begins to work out a theory, if you like, or he's the first one to really start to write to justify the position of being in the military or being a soldier as something that's important for Christians, and to start to write about how one would conduct oneself and how you decide what's right to do. A little later, and Stephen, you can go to the next slide, we have Augustine, or Augustine, depending on how you want to pronounce his name. He is the major Christian thinker who works in what we would think of as the Christian West. He's in North Africa, but he works in Latin. Really until you get to Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, the major Christian theorist. And just to put his dates in perspective, he's born in 354 and he dies in 430. And what you need to know is that the Roman Empire in the West collapses in 410. So his lifespan, but particularly his time as bishop of Hippo, overlaps that period when the Christian Empire, or the Roman Empire in the West, falls. But war and threat from outside is quite constant during his time as a Christian leader, as bishop of a place called Hippo. And he is the one who works out what's been known subsequently as just war theory. And I want to say that just war theory, there's further development of it over the centuries, and there is there's tweaking of it, but his work is still quite foundational for thinking for Christians and for governments who wish to do so, to think about whether a particular war is just and justifiable. And for Augustine, these are the critical points. War has to be something that has the authority of the state behind it, whatever that legitimate authority is. And then he thought that even if the state is behind it, there are two other questions that help you determine as a citizen, my term, not his, whether this can be a just war. Is this something that is in the pursuit of justice and peace? Is it to protect your property? Is it to ensure that something catastrophic doesn't happen by way of an outside attack? And also, is the war going to be conducted in a moral way, or was it, if you're looking at a past one, conducted in a moral or a principled way? No denial that war is brutal, that it involves the taking of life, the potential loss of life. But those are the questions for him. And when I say this is not just something in the faraway past, it is something that's been particularly important within the Roman Catholic Church and Roman Catholic thinking down through the years. It gets tweaked a little bit by Thomas Aquinas. But I remember that in what we think of as the First Gulf War, those of you of a certain age will remember this. This is 1991. The Roman Catholic Church in the US did an assessment of whether they thought, the Roman Catholic bishops, did they think American participation in that particular conflict, which was led by the US. This is the one where Herbert Bush leads a coalition, of which Canada was a part, in an attack on Iraq. The American Catholic bishops concluded that, in fact, it was not it did not fit the criteria of a just war. So it's something that continues to be used by Christians. Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. If you're talking about Christian attitudes to war and to the office of a soldier, one needs to talk a little bit about the Crusades. This is a development, the name refers to attacks by, in this case, folks from Europe in the Middle East, primarily, the first of which occurs in 1095. And this is not about just war. This is about a holy war, where the enemy is somebody who is outside the faith tradition. And so it's a conflict where, if you're a Christian, according to the thinking of the notion of a crusade, you were able to conquer such an enemy. So it's not about preserving the peace. It's not about justice or protecting your life or your property. It is about something you're doing in the name of your faith tradition, and against an enemy who is perceived to be outside that tradition and functioning in a way that is, well, you're just not worried about it, because this is something that, to quote a phrase from that first crusade, that God wills. Thinking behind crusades, the theological justification for it, in fact, borrows much from some Old Testament texts, particularly in the book of Deuteronomy, where the people of Israel, in their entry into the promised land and their life in it, will engage at points in holy war against their enemies. And so behind it, there is a sense of devotion to one's own faith tradition, a sense that that's right, and a sense that there is another one that is wrong, and that for a variety of reasons, it's okay for you to go to war against such a country, such a people, such a power. And again, in subsequent Christian history, this idea will come back again. So Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. I mentioned Augustine. Thomas Aquinas is a 13th century figure. And along with Augustine, one can argue with this, but without question, two of the great theologians of the Western Christian tradition. Thomas Aquinas, I guess the best way I will put this is, he really did a kind of compendium of Christian theology and Christian thinking about a huge range of topics, including the topic of war. And again, what he did was to slightly tweak that just war theory that had been handed down from Augustine. He's really clear that it needs to be at the command of whatever the legitimate government is. And not for the first time, and not for the last time, Christians thinking about war and what a just war is make a particular appeal to Romans 13, 1-7. This is the text where Paul argues that when he's writing to the church in Rome, that members of that church need to be subject to the governing authorities. The cause of the war had to be just, and the soldiers who fought in it needed to have the right intent. I think it's fair to say that what you have with Aquinas and his effort to, I shall say, restate just war theory is a response to, in fact, the Crusades. By this point, the Crusades are over. The last several of them were totally unsuccessful. In one case, in fact, it became a crusade against Christians in the old Eastern Roman Empire, not against folks who were not Christian. And so I think that is a major reason for him in his work to restate that. He also raises the question, and Luther and others will come to this later, of whether it's okay to revolt against a tyrant. And he sort of addresses that question and appeals a bit to Romans 13, but doesn't answer it quite as fulsomely as we might like, or as I might like. Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. So we get to the 16th century and you have the Protestant Reformation. I know I'm doing some history here as background for how we might think about the office of the soldier or the military person, and also Christian attitudes around war and peace. But in the 16th century, so I'm not going to do a lot of Reformation history, but I need to talk a bit about Luther in this context. He is the first major, and I will say successful reformer, successful in that he lives to perpetrate his cause. And it's clear as his cause begins to gain support that other German city-states, not to mention the Emperor of Spain, Charles I, are anxious to put down what they see as heresy, and they are quite prepared to bring military force against Luther, against the German nobles who support him. And so Luther is very fortunate that every time forces are ready to be massed against him, something happens that diverts them. But there is within what's now Germany, there is in 1525 a major revolt, the so-called Peasants' War, where a number of peasants revolt against really intolerable conditions under which they live, and their abuse by German nobles, many of whom are in fact supporters of Luther. And Luther makes clear that this revolt is wrong, and he in effect invites the nobles to end it via bloodshed, and they do quite brutally. And shortly after that has happened, there's a military officer who has a crisis of conscience about whether, in fact, if he's a soldier, can he be saved? Or is his exercise of a military profession something that inevitably means that on Judgment Day, he will be found wanting and sent to eternal fires? And so Luther, if I might use a modern phrase, in conversation with him, offers him pastoral counseling. And Luther makes clear that, in fact, he thinks that the military military occupation is a quite appropriate one for a Christian, and that indeed a Christian can be both a soldier and, if we like, in good standing, or, as the phrase goes, can be saved. It requires the Christian who is a soldier to have, quote, the right attitude and to live in a certain way. The man to whom he talks is extremely grateful. He is, as I said earlier, what we would call an officer now. And he urges Luther to write down what he said to him so that it can be shared with others who he believes are wrestling with the same questions that he is. Luther doesn't get around to doing this, and the man is in touch with him again. And finally, in 1527, Luther writes this treatise. And I note here the 4 points, and I'm not going to read those. It's really, again, a development, a restating of Augustine's just war theory, with a real emphasis, though, for Luther that rebellion against the government is always wrong. And when you read through the treatise, Luther comes back again and again to Romans 13, 1-7. The notion that the governing authorities are there, they are divine instruments. God has placed them there, has given them the sword to maintain order. So rebellion is always wrong. And Luther carries it to the extent that even if you think the government has erred in going to war, but you're a soldier, you still have a duty to participate in that. God will, in Luther's eyes, judge the government, or judge the noble, or judge the monarch, who has wrongly engaged in war, and God will also judge soldiers who kill and destroy for its own sake, or who seek glory, or who are inappropriate in how they carry out their duty. But rebellion is always wrong, and you leave it to God to straighten that out. You do your duty. And so for Luther, he's quite clear, more clear than Aquinas was, that no matter how odious the government, you can't rebel. Stephen, if you can go on to the next slide. So there is also in the 16th century another group of reformers. These are the folks we call Anabaptists, and their contemporary followers would be Mennonites or Hutterites. So in the 16th century, in the responses to the church of the day, you have Luther and his followers. You have the Reformed movement, the folks we would think of now as Presbyterians, as Congregationalists, who are part of the Reformed tradition. Think Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin here. And we also have the radical reformers. These are folks who, in fact, try as much as possible to recreate and live according to the teachings of Jesus and the way in which first century Christians lived and reacted to the world in which they lived. In the contemporary world, contemporary Canada, there are many different Mennonite groups and Hutterite groups and the Amish and so on, so the Anabaptist groups. But in the 16th century, these are the folks who take the most radical position back to the roots, if you like, in terms of how they live and how they understand what the Christian faith demands of them. And one of the things it demands of them is that they will never take an oath, they will not participate in government, and they will be pacifist. They understand all these things to be hallmarks of first century Christianity, and they endeavor to live according to them. I need to say that the folks who had these views are in Christian history the group that has suffered the greatest persecution. There are more Anabaptists killed in the 16th and 17th centuries by Roman Catholics, by every other Protestant group, than there were Christians killed by Romans from the 1st through the early 4th century. And they, as I say, they are universally condemned, and they spend much of the 16th and 17th centuries trying to move from one place to another to find a place that will allow them to live and not take part in government, and even more, not take part in the military. And it is the sense that those stances, particularly their unwillingness to serve in the military, makes them a threat to the society. And they're questioning really all the major society beliefs of the day. That's what leads to their persecution. But their witness to pacifism becomes, if you like, the third major Christian response to the office of the soldier and of war. So one of those responses is just war theory. Another response is the crusade. And the third response is pacifism. Stephen, if you can move on to the next slide. I'm just going to do a real quick jump here to say that those perspectives that you see in the 16th century continue through to the present. And I think that, well, certainly in the 19th century, to just say something that's not on the slide, the 19th century is the era, the time from the 16th century to the present, where there were the fewest major wars in what we would call the West, thinking of Western Europe, thinking of Canada and US. There are relatively few. In fact, some of you may know a book written by Margaret Macmillan called The War That Ended Peace. And she looks at the fact that between 1815 and 1914, it was generally a time of peace. And in fact, it's an era with a number of humanitarian movements, including a significant peace movement. Now, this is happening despite, I know, the colonization of Africa by various European countries. But that's that notion of the importance of peace, and if not for many people, an absolute notion of pacifism, very much a sense of just war, and that war was something that could and should be avoided. That's a fairly strong current in the 19th century. And I think to comment just quickly on two factors that have emerged since World War II, in terms of how we think about the military and attitudes to it. In some countries, certainly I would say including our own, peacekeeping has become an important aspect of military service and of what it is that we ask our Canadian Armed Forces to do. And the other reality which shapes how many Christians in the beginning after World War II thought about war and peace was the development of atomic, now nuclear weapons. And the awareness certainly that this isn't something that you can use for its use. Certainly you can't have a world war where folks would do this. It would simply result in, and this was a phrase particularly prominent in the 1980s, mutually assured destruction, or MAD as it was known. Stephen, you go to the next slide. I want to talk a little bit, thinking ahead to Remembrance Day, about attitudes to Canadian participation in the two world wars of the 20th century. And the attitude of the church and indeed of the wider society to those two world wars are really quite different. I mentioned you'd have this long period of relative peace before World War I breaks out. And World War I is a war in which folks enter into with much idealism. It's a war that many Christian leaders in Canada treated, I think it's fair to say, as a crusade. And for example, churches were used for recruiting drives. J.S. Woodworth leaves the Methodist ministry over his experience of a church service he attends at what was then St. James Methodist Church in Montreal, and just in way the war was approached. And this was something that was certainly not unique to Methodism. It marked a number of different church groups in Canada at the time. There was very much a connection between volunteering for the war and being a faithful Christian. And by the time the war ends, the loss of life in it, the sheer brutality of it, there's clearly a loss of idealism by the end of the war. And it will lead many of those church leaders and their successors, in fact, to develop through the 1920s, and especially as you get into the 1930s, a very strong peace movement in this country. And it's really a reaction to that war. I don't mean to suggest that those who in fact volunteered, served there, they very much were moved by a sense of willingness to engage in sacrifice, all sorts of other things too. I mean, at the beginning of that war, it was seen as something of an adventure. Nobody had a sense of how long it would last or how brutal it would be. And when I say how brutal it will be, I want to just mention a feature of this, because in much of Canada, November 11th, we think of it as Remembrance Day, but for Canada's most easterly province, Newfoundland and Labrador, the real equivalent of that is July 1st. And to give you a sense of what I'm talking about, the kind of horror of World War I, July 1st was the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And the Royal Newfoundland Regiment was involved in that. And in the space of less than 30 minutes, over 90% of the regiment were casualties. It was, in fact, the heaviest day of loss that British armed forces with whom the Royal Newfoundland Regiment fought, has ever experienced was July 1st, 1916. And so if you're in Newfoundland Labrador, July 1st is, yes, it's Canada Day, but in fact, it's the day in which Beaumont Hamel continues to be remembered. So I mentioned the interwar years. World War II, I think it's fair to say, churches enter far more soberly in their attitude to it. And it is much more, I'm noticing Paula Gale's note in the chat. Yes, it is Memorial Day, and it starts with that title in July 1st, 1917. World War II is entered into much more with on the basis of, I'd say, just war theory. There is a sense that this is an unfortunate but necessary conflict, and just war theory is part of that. Those are the kinds of arguments that are made. It is the case there had been that really strong peace movement in the church, in the wider Canadian society. And in early September of 1939, there were 75 United Church members, many of the ministers, who wrote an open letter urging the Canadian government not to participate in the war, really reflecting that earlier peace movement. And the General Council executive of the day disowned it, made clear that in fact Canada should enter the war and that the United Church would be behind it. And a number of those ministers who signed it, many of them in fact wound up being removed from their pastoral charges by action of their congregations. There's very strong support of the war, but you have again that tension from before. Stephen, if you can move on to the next slide. Canadian involvement since then, we've had the Korean War, which Canada was involved in as part of a UN mission. I mentioned peacekeeping, involved really in that from 1956, and still are. Afghanistan, which is the other situation, first time since the Korean War. Well, so the first Gulf War in 1991, there are Canadian forces involved, but there are no deaths from that. But with Afghanistan, where we're involved from 2001, after the attack on the World Trade Center, we're involved there from 2001 to 2014. And Canadian military deaths are 158, and a large, significant number, around 1,800 folks who are wounded, Canadian forces wounded in that conflict. I'm struck also in as we think about the context of Remembrance Day and thinking about self-sacrifice, thinking about those who've served and who currently do serve in the military in this country. Over the last, it may be longer, I'm just aware over the last several decades of the number of times that the military has been engaged in humanitarian work within Canada. I mean, initially I want to think about peacekeeping, but also here at home. And I'm just aware, somebody who lives in Eastern Ontario, of the fact that in the midst of the pandemic, we've had Canadian military personnel working this spring in long-term care homes, where just because so many staff were ill, they were short-staffed. And a number of those folks who came in and worked, particularly folks with medical backgrounds, but not all, themselves, yes, here in Ontario, also in Quebec. These are the two provinces. Thank you, Beryl, because that's absolutely true. I'm thinking, because I'm sitting here in Ontario, but it is both in Ontario and Quebec. Many of those folks became ill. And so we think about what motivated Canadians in the 20th century, but here also in the 21st. And there is, I think, it's dangerous to start guessing about why people do undertake any of the calls to which we respond. I think the willingness to try to serve is pretty key here, and something that I suspect is if not universal, probably pretty close. So Stephen, we're going to move on to another section, but I don't know if you want to stop here briefly. I've recited a lot of history here, just to set the context for this particular theme of soldiers, because that history continues very much to inform a lot of the contemporary thinking. Stephen, I think you're still muted.
I need to unmute. I'm just thinking it's always tough to do overview like that in 35 minutes of almost 2,000 years of history. But it's so helpful to have that kind of framework and just see how the thinking of church people has developed over the years, and to reflect on the contexts in which it developed. Wondering, I mean, a couple of people are adding points, and that's helpful, but I'm wondering if there are questions, thoughts, important things that you'd like to add into that framework. Neil Parker says, thanks, John, for acknowledging our folks. Military personnel sign up for unlimited liability, which means that they can be ordered to undertake tasks that may kill them. Yeah. That's not quite the same as for police or firefighters. That means they can also be ordered to deal with fatal diseases. Thank you, Neil. That's important. Questions, thoughts? How does that framework hang together for you? You've stunned us all into silence, John.
No, and I'm happy to move on. I'm just going to move to a different, really to a bit of a different theme. That is,
I think that's important, and certainly you've picked up all the major threads. So let's carry on, but remind people again, if you want to add questions to the chat as we go along, then we'll certainly pose them next time we come to a stopping point.
So if you can go back to this, yep, there we come. Thanks, Stephen. And so if you can move on to the next slide, I really want to talk about why it would be important to preach on this theme. In other words, to come in relation to Remembrance Day to offer some reflection. So one reason is that I think people in our congregations or our communities of faith, I think it doesn't matter where you are, there are different those different positions that we see in Christian history are still at play. We may not meet the crusading one very much, but certainly in the places that I served when I was in congregational ministry, I had folks in the congregations who would have been pacifist, and I had folks who were clearly believed in just war and understood World War II, which is the one they would have been thinking about for the most part, as a just war. And you have folks who wonder then, is there a particular correct position to take? Folks who are aware both those exist. There is not one Christian position, I don't think, clearly. But it is, I think, important in the context to acknowledge Remembrance Day and what it represents. I think in devoting a service around this and reflecting, it's really important to make clear that remembering those who fought and those who died and those who came back injured in body or in mind from those conflicts, it is one thing to remember that, but remembering, in fact, is not about glorifying war or saying war is good. I don't think anybody wants to say that or do that. But I think there has been ambivalence that if you're remembering, are you doing that? And I think the answer is no. And I think it's really important to, again, to remember, to acknowledge, and also to be clear that war is simply a very ugly thing. Stephen, if you want to go on to the next slide. And this is just something I would want to note, that certainly I think within the last, probably I would say within the last 50 years and so on or so. It's probably been there before too, but I'm just aware, and this isn't really reflecting in terms of my own lifetime, that there is there are these varied views. For some, an enthusiastic embrace of the military, and for others, ambivalence. And I think the ambivalence again relates to a concern about glorifying war, or perhaps in a nuclear age, what war could mean. And again, there are folks who, for reasons of their own understanding of the Christian faith tradition, are pacifist. Stephen, if you can go on to the next slide. When I was thinking about this particular webinar, I was reflecting on just how I'm going to offer a few autobiographical reflections, because I've seen interesting change in my own lifetime in terms of how Remembrance Day is understood, reflected on, and how folks participate in it. So I'll just give you a quick piece of context. So I'm a baby boomer. I'm in my late 60s. So when I was a child growing up in a village in New Brunswick, the fathers of many of my classmates in my early grades were themselves veterans of World War II. And there were within my village at that point in time some folks who'd served in World War I. Remembrance Day was a really big deal when I was a child in the late 50s. So thinking here now, late 50s and early 1960s. My father, it was something we did each year as we went to a local cenotaph. For my father, who'd had a nephew killed in World War II, this was really important. But my dad was not unique, and that was simply a reality of growing up. I knew that our next door neighbor on one side had been in the Navy, and our next door neighbor on the other was in a wheelchair because he had lost his leg to a landmine shortly after the landings in Normandy as Canadian forces were proceeding inland. So that's kind of the world in which I grew up. Starting probably in the late 60s, but I'm really aware of it by the early 70s when I'm at university. I went to Mount A in Sackville, New Brunswick, and the Remembrance Day service on campus attracted very few people. This is also, this is when controversy about Vietnam is greatest. And there is some angst about nuclear weapons and so on. But there's a fairly strong anti-war sentiment, very present in the United States, but it comes over into Canada too, and it leads to a kind of ambivalence about Remembrance Day, I think. A lot fewer folks were attending at Cenotaph during the 70s, 80s, and I would say into the early 90s. My own sense is it was not an unwillingness to honor vets, but folks had trouble figuring out how to do that with some of those other things that were going on. I taught at Queen's University from 1991 till the spring of 2016. And Queen's had a Remembrance Day service every year. My memory of the early 90s in Grant Hall, which held 900 people, you could show up at 5 to 11 and it was reasonably full, but you could get a seat. By 2005 or so, you needed to show up at 10:45 to 11, and by 10 to 11, Grant Hall was standing room only. There's been a willingness, which I think is a good willingness, to again remember and in that sense honor. One's not honoring war, but one's honoring folks who participated, and I think one's honoring their grief. And I'll say more about that when I come to talk about how I would preach on this topic. And it's interesting that if my generation were the children of vets, it is their grandchildren, World War II vets. It's their grandchildren, some degree great grandchildren, that have returned again to this topic. And that's not an unknown thing for the children to disagree with the parents, and the grandchildren to, in fact, align with the grandparents. And again, it's interesting, just that difference, that this is something that seems to have become more important again. And an important part of your context in preaching is how is that holiday, how is that day celebrated where you are? Somebody's noting, just I noticed in the chat that showed up, that ambivalence, yes, is why in some, so it's a holiday a statutory holiday in PEI and in New Brunswick, and in the 3 prairie provinces in BC and the territories, but it isn't in well, Newfoundland it is, but it's related to July 1st primarily, but in Nova Scotia and in Quebec and Ontario, it's not. And again, to acknowledge something somebody else has said, I think, yes, the ambivalence, I think in many ways goes back to Vietnam, which may not have been, quote, our war, but certainly that shaped that. So we wanted also to talk about, some passages. If you were going to preach on this, if you were going to put a service around on this, what might be some passages that you'd want to use? I'm going to go over to Catherine for that. And Stephen, if you can advance the slides.
My autobiographical note is that although Remembrance Day was observed as a holiday, there was a football game. And so that would be the clash between parent and child. Would I be permitted to go to the high school football game on Remembrance Day? It seemed disrespectful, according to my parents. I get that. So a few ideas here for coming at this from scripture. And what we have offered here is about a half dozen different things that you might want to look at for texts for preaching. So Stephen, the first one, if you'll bring it up, thank you. Great, all right, I'm just switching my screen here. So in terms of the holiness and the relationship, which is part of Trinitarian theology, this concept, no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. There's lots of room in there to move into a very poignant homiletic moment. I'm going to move through these fairly quickly. The next one, thank you very much. Matthew 10, this passage that flummoxes us so often, do not think that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I've not come to bring peace, but a sword. And then there's a long iteration of family relationships that are broken, and those who find their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. A bit of a scary mandate, harsh words perhaps, but also some commentary. One could offer commentary in preaching on the depth of commitment that a person has in going forward as the one who is called upon to go to war to bring the sword. The next one, thanks, Stephen. It's interesting, and Mark's gospel puts it the most succinctly, when the centurion who stood facing Jesus saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly, this man was God's son. So succinct. And so it's a military person, the centurion, who is the first person who acknowledges the divinity of Christ at the time of the death of Jesus. Absolutely marvelous passage, small verse, lots of room for some remarkable preaching there. Let's move on. Thanks, Stephen. Exodus 15, because it's women, not just men, and because this oldest part of the Exodus story is a song of jubilation that God has triumphed. The horse and rider have been thrown into the sea. They've been defeated. The song of Miriam, the dancing and the singing. This is an important song of victory. And we need to be able to come to this song in a variety of ways. And it would be an interesting sermon to put together to consider the vocation of a soldier and the whole question of war from the perspective of Miriam, the prophet Miriam, who led her people out of slavery. Next one, thanks, Stephen. Joshua. So we've got a couple of things going on here with the stories of Joshua. We've got the invasion of Jericho, the invasion of Canaan. And so it reads, once when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. The commander of the army of the Lord said to Joshua, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy. And Joshua did so. So there is a holiness, a sacred nature in this concept of one group of people fighting against another that we need to pay attention to. The other thing, of course, about the invasion of Canaan is that there are great parallels to the invasion of this continent by the ancestors of those of us who are European. So lots of room for thought there about the use of military force. The next one, thank you very much. Revelation. You can always have a good time in Revelation. It is just the best thing. And in my experience, when we say to a congregation, we're working on Revelation, people show up because it is so stunningly difficult and it is bright, vibrant, fascinating. So here, war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And then we continue on the next slide. This is so exciting. Several chapters later, then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, with such violence, Babylon, the great city, will be thrown down and will be found no more. We are called to stand against empire frequently. And here we go. Let's have some time in Revelation when we need to be talking about that. A couple of more pieces briefly. Thanks, Stephen. 2 Samuel 23. John pointed this piece out to me. It is not in the lectionary, and it's not a familiar story to most of us who spend time with David and with Goliath and with the Philistines and so on. But this wonderful story in 2 Samuel. And David says, with great longing and yearning in his voice, if someone would bring me water to drink from the well of Bethlehem, the well by the gate. You can just hear him remembering this wonderful place. And then 3 of the warriors break through the camp of the Philistines, go and get the water and bring it back. And David won't drink of it. He pours it out as a sacrifice because he acknowledges the huge effort to which those 3 warriors had gone, the sacrifice that they had made to get it. And instead of merely drinking it, he offers it as a holy offering to God, to God's very, very self. So there's something very rich in here about sacrifice that merits looking at. And because it's a fresh piece of scripture, it's a joy to do the research and to bring it to a listening congregation. And so finally, this evening, the text that John is going to work on, and I'm going to read it to you. As I'm fond of saying, it's not short because it's long. Here we are. So it is, oh, sorry, I've got the spinning wheel of, here we are. So from 2 Samuel, in chapter 1. Then David took hold of his clothes and tore them. And all the men who were with him did the same. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. David intoned this lamentation over Saul and over his son Jonathan. David said, your glory, O Israel, lies slain upon the high places. how the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath, proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, or the daughters of the Philistines will rejoice. The daughters of the uncircumcised will exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor bounteous fields. For there, the shield of the mighty was defiled, the shield of Saul anointed with oil. No more. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back, nor the sword of Saul return empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely. In life and in death, they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. O daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you in crimson, in luxury, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved you were to me. Your love to me was wonderful, passing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. Those are some pieces you could choose to work with, and John has chosen to work with this strong piece from 2 Samuel. So, John, over to you again.
Thanks, Catherine. Appreciate that. And Stephen, if you can advance this and to the next one. So anytime we preach, context is really important. I mean, what's going on in the community, and events in the community, I think, no matter how much one might want to follow a lectionary, events dictate sometimes what we need to do. And certainly, I think when it comes to a Sunday around Remembrance Day, it will depend to some degree, yes, on where you are. But I think attention to this becomes important in terms of what's happening nationally, but also in terms of what's happening locally. I've put some questions up here, and I'm not going to I'm going to spend time running through them in particular, but I want to just note a couple of things in relation to context. So I'm aware that this year we're not going to have, because of the pandemic, the kinds of cenotaph services that usually take place won't be this year. Or I'm not saying that they won't, but generally, my understanding is they'll be by invitation. Folks aren't going to be gathering in sort of a mass in the way in which they usually do. And so I think for this year in particular, thinking about what one might want to do around this, it's to bear in mind also that that's not going to be happening for folks. And what does that mean for your service? I think, again, important to think about who's likely tuning into your service. I'm reflecting just for myself at the moment, the places that I served in congregational ministry, and in the congregation I currently attend. I've yet to be in a congregation where there were not folks with a child serving in the Canadian military, either currently serving or had done so fairly recently. So that's a connection that's there. I also served, before I went to Queen's, I served for 5 years in a pastoral charge north of Kingston. And the northern part of that, fairly poor land, a lot of back to the landers moved in there in the late 60s, early 70s, including a number of people who had grown up in the United States and who came to Canada in the late 1960s, very early 1970s to avoid the draft. And they settled and on very marginal land, and often brought other skills with them, and are still there. So when I would have a service coming up toward Remembrance Day, when I was there, I had people in the congregation who were veterans. And I also had a gentleman in the choir of one of those churches who, in fact, had grown up in the United States and had lived in Canada since 1970 and would never go back to the States again, not able to go back because he had come to Canada, in that sense, illegally from his perspective. And so you need to think about who's there because it shapes their questions. You also need to think about what the rituals might be, knowing that this year they will be very different. Stephen, you can go to the next slide. If I'm preaching on this text, I want to, at some point, it doesn't have to be the first thing I do, but at some point early on, I'm acknowledging that Remembrance Day is coming up. And then when I move to the passage, whether I start with that acknowledgement or get to it fairly early, I think I need to spend a bit of time talking about Saul and providing some background. Many folks who gather in United Church communities of faith do not have a particularly strong knowledge of the Bible. And I think in particular with Saul, to the extent we do, Saul gets, frankly, a bad rap in 1 Samuel. 1 and 2 Samuel, David's the hero. 2 Samuel is wonderfully honest about David and his life, but he is still the great king. And Saul, for all his issues, was somebody who I think certainly tried hard. And at points, there's a tension when you read through 1 Samuel about Saul. Sometimes he's regarded quite well, and other times much less well. Today, we would probably say he clearly suffered from some kind of mental health issue. But I think you need to give a bit of background on Saul, his reign, and also his death in battle. And I would certainly be starting there. And then, Stephen, you can move on to the next slide. So I'm wanting to start with this passage itself. And as Catherine, the men he has around him. But he is in fact also grieving here. It's a really, I think this is a really powerful lament for the loss of a nation's leader in a military defeat, for the loss of lives in battle, and that's the public piece he's calling folks to. And I mean, 3 times in that lament, he says, how the mighty have fallen, 3 times. And the second time it's followed by in the midst of battle. And finally, it's followed by, and the weapons of war perished. David's not naive. He knows that Saul's death opens a pathway for him to the throne. Okay. And David is not without self-interest. But in this passage, when you read it, you don't see that self-interest at all. He sets his own interests aside. And this is a very human David we see elsewhere in 2 Samuel. This is a really human David who calls on others in his nation to grieve, and as they grieve, to remember the positive things about Saul and not the negative. And in doing so, I think he gives voice to a national grief. And in doing so, is this true in our own lives? By giving, by giving attention to that, by giving, if you like, permission, encouragement for that, he also allows it to be acknowledged. And it has grief, whether public or private, has to be acknowledged if you're going to be able to move on from it. And David also, in this passage, he grieves his own personal life, personal, private, however you want to frame it, for Jonathan, who is his closest friend. And so I think that it's a passage, if you like, that invites us to think about grief, to think about loss. And Stephen, if you can move on to the next slide. Again, as I've said before, war is ugly. It is never to be glorified. But Remembrance Day is about both a public grief and a private grief. For many of us, it's more public because for many of us, very few of us were alive in World War I, and a larger number arrived alive for Korea, the Korean War, but not. So it would be Afghanistan that we might remember in this way. But for those who've been at war and come home, grief is like David's. It's a grief primarily for those who did not. A personal story. This was during the first pastoral charge I served in Nova Scotia. And I remember visiting with a vet. He had been part of a bomber squadron with the RCAF during World War II. And he joined up in 1940 after he had turned 18. And amazingly, he made it all the way through the war in a bomber squadron. But I remember at one point we were chatting, and he went away, and he came back and showed me a picture. And it was a picture of his squadron taken in Montreal before they headed over to Europe in 1940. And he looked at it and he said, and I can't remember now whether there were 400 in the squadron or 480 personnel. I mean, it was multiple of 8. But he said, 80% of the folks you see in this photo never came back. And so when he thought about the war, that was the thing he thought about, not why he went, but about those who went with him and who hadn't come home. That's part of what this day represents. And I think for many of us now, we might tune into some of that if we think a little bit in terms of the public piece, just the reaction many of us had this spring to the shootings in Nova Scotia. I don't mean to say they're the same thing, but you remember after that, there was that need for public grief. And Stephen mentioned the other day that through United in Learning, there was a vigil that drew people in from across the country. And there's also a private grief. Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. So again, to think about current context, and here I'm reflecting to some degree where I live, because I live about a 35 to 40 minute drive from Trenton, Ontario, where there's a very large Canadian Forces base. But that Forces base is where Canadian military personnel were killed in Afghanistan. This is where their bodies were brought back to CFB Trenton and then taken from there by car to Toronto. And fairly early on in that process, what began to happen, the government renamed the highway, the section of Highway 401, called it the Highway of Heroes, but people began to gather on the overpasses when they knew that there would be one or, and sometimes a long procession of hearses traveling along. And it was a really interesting public witness and public grief. And I remember also watching some of those, watching as bodies were being loaded from Afghanistan on planes, and the palpable grief of those who were doing this for their comrades, as well as for folks over here in the sense of families. I don't know if that will be true for people in the communities of faith where you're going to be leading worship on Sunday. But those, for some of us at least, are memories that speak, I think, to in a contemporary way to some of what was would have been happening in an earlier generation in relation to World War II, and in a yet earlier generation to World War I. And I think that the grief we think about here is grief for the loss of life. It's the private grief for the loss of possibility. It's what that kind of grief has always been about. It's what that kind of grief that David speaks about in this lament, where he remembers and offers praise, and yet he grieves for the loss of that life and the loss of possibility. And Stephen, if you can go to the next slide. I note here that it's, I'm just noticing Rosemary is commenting, and yes, that public grief gets shown in the bouquets of flowers and of teddy bears and so on. And we saw that in Nova Scotia. And I'm thinking again, we saw it. I remember hearing an interview with a guy who said, I just have to go to that road in Portapic, and I know I can't go in, but I have to go there. It's part of, and it was part of his own grief process. If I'm thinking about the service, it's always dangerous to talk about why folks enlisted and served. And some of the sermons that I heard as a child were quite clear about what that was. And it was very much a sense of Christian duty and so on. But I'm aware, as I note here, certainly that those who enlisted for World War II, some folks went over to World War I at the beginning with a sense of adventure. It wasn't true for those who went later, and certainly not for those who went for World War II or Korea or Afghanistan. There is a sense of, and I think it's important to talk about, a willingness to serve, and to serve at personal cost, at potentially the cost of one's own life. There's a notion here of self-sacrifice that's very much involved here, a willingness to do that. Sometimes folks are really conscious of it, but at certainly some less than full conscious level, it has to be there. And I think in this Remembrance Day, or this time, I'd also consider commenting on some of the risks that contemporary Canadian military personnel run. Think about the peacekeeping missions. I mean, Rwanda in particular, speaking about risk, but also right now I've been thinking about those who served this spring in long-term care homes, whether in Ontario or Quebec, and in other things. But that's one where there's been real and considerable risk, and again, a risk to future health that we don't fully understand. And Stephen, one final slide that we want to leave with you. These are just some resources that Catherine and I talked about in terms of thinking about what to say. And I'll comment just on particularly a couple of them, but Roland Bainton's book, 60 years old, but it's still a good kind of classic study of Christian attitudes down through the years. Mark Twain's The War Prayer, if you've never read it, is worth reading. It is it speaks to the problems of believing that God is on your side and that sort of prayer. And it's also just the sheer horror of war. We put down two movies. Passchendaele, a Canadian movie, about the Battle of Passchendaele. Paul Gross, some of you may remember, if you're of a certain age, him playing in Due South. But in this case, he had a grandfather who served at Passchendaele, and the movie was something of his own, coming to terms with that. And War Horse, an American movie, but a fairly recent one and poignant and powerful. And I'm aware time is running out, but if you have other things that you would recommend, we'd be interested in those too. I don't mean just Catherine and me, but I think collectively. Anyway, I need to stop there.
I'll pick up for a moment the two novels that are there, Generals Die in Bed and The German Heiress. Generals Die in Bed was written in 1930, remarkable text. And Annika Scott's The German Heiress came out April of this year. So very different voices. And two very different ways into soldiering, and through these fictions, ways to come at these issues and to offer preaching points for our congregations.
Well, thank you, friends. Thank you for... Again, it's an overview. How can it be otherwise in 90 minutes? It just scratches the surface, and yet the comments that have been coming in through the chat, they're comments, not questions. They're expansions, and the folks who are writing are telling personal stories. I think responding, John, to a lot of the personal stories you've been giving. Again, saying how this touches them, and the theme of sacrifice is a powerful one here. We only have a few minutes because we did kind of covenant to run for 90 minutes, and so we're pretty close to done. I just noticed
Wendy's comment on the movie Dunkirk, and that's a good suggestion. Yes.
Sure, I had wondered about that too. It was a helpful conversation between Neil and Cecile earlier about the difference with Neil's living in a society where everybody is expected to serve. They're required to as young people, and so it's different from Canada, where people choose. important conversation there.
Yeah, we did have conscription at the end of toward the end of each war, but relatively few conscripts actually wound up getting overseas into action. So, but it was, yep. But it is different from where you have a universal draft or universal requirement for service. Yes.
Certainly, in the churches I've served, the themes of grief and sacrifice are really important ones. Nobody on Remembrance Day ever wants to talk about the wisdom of war. I've never been to a service that glorified it. And I remember a master sergeant retired in one of my congregations telling me that he didn't think anybody ever fought for their country. They fought for their buddies. Country was too abstract, and the bombs start flying around and you're worried about the people next to you. And it's that kind of personal grief, but about the impact of war and being caught up in something crazy and bigger than any of us.
You're absolutely right, Stephen. I had a sergeant who said there are only 6 people in a war. And that was your section.
Sorry, I'm groping for your spotlight, Nagel. Thank you. Want to make sure we can see you.
Yeah. There are only 6 people, and you know their names, and you've probably met the wives, and you know their children. Nothing more than that.
Yeah. I think there may be times in the life of the church where it's appropriate to be talking about government policy, but I don't think that's what Remembrance Day is about. Remembrance Day is about the impact of war on individuals. Other thoughts, comments? Again, I'm aware of time. We covenanted with you for 90 minutes, and I want to respect that, but I also don't want to cut off what has been a fruitful and helpful time here. Seeing none, let me draw us to a close, and then I'll invite Catherine to close with prayer. Thank you. Thank you to both of you. And I know you take turns in this, so we'll probably hear a little more from Catherine next time and a little less from John. And,
yes.
And over the 3 weeks, we'll hear from both of you, and that's you're such a powerful team. I'm feeling a sense of awe and holiness in the midst of the conversation tonight. And thank you for that. And thank you for taking the topic seriously and engaging us in the history, but also in the human impact of these things. Friends, I will post the recording of this event within a couple of days, so you can go and find it at United in Learning. We gather again next week. It is Remembrance Day. We are aware of it. We had actually some long conversation about whether it was appropriate to be holding a webinar on Remembrance Day, and we decided that by evening, most people were in a different frame of mind. So I hope that's true for you, and that you will join us next week for a conversation about saints. And if it still feels like Remembrance Day that day and you'd rather watch us in the recording, we'll certainly do that too. Thanks for joining us tonight. And Catherine, I'll invite you to close us with prayer, if you please.
Thank you. I'm bringing you a blessing that is familiar to some of you, and I want to offer it with regard to our subject at hand this evening, but also the subject that is wider at hand. And so I'm bringing you a blessing from the Riverside Church in the city of New York, from the Reverend William Sloane Coffin, who was senior minister there a number of years ago. I think it helps us as we're moving through elections. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May God give you grace not to sell yourself short, grace to risk something big for something good, grace to remember that the world is now too dangerous for anything but truth, and too small for anything but love. May God take your minds and think through them. May God take your lips and speak through them. May God take your hands and work through them. May God take your hearts and set them on fire. Amen.
Okay, so that draws to a close our the formal time of our evening. I will leave the chat open for as long as there are people adding comments, and I want to thank you for all the comments